O heavenly King, comfort of the Spirit of truth, who everywhere present and fillest all things, treasure of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity, save our souls of evil.
Amen.
Okay, so where did we leave off?
Halfway through on obedience.
I don't think we hadn't started the thief about the thief who repented yet.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's right.
That's where we were.
We got into St. Ignatius.
Yeah.
So we'll do. And this is basically stories.
Yeah.
And they're great stories. So, classical stories. So you want to read?
Yes.
This is chapter 11 of the fourth step.
About a thief who repented. Terrible indeed was the judgment of a good judge and shepherd which I once saw in a monastery. For while I was there, it happened that a thief sought for admission to the monastic life, and that most excellent pastor and physician ordered him to take 7 days of complete rest just to see the kind of life in the place. When the week had passed, the pastor called him and asked him privately, "Would you like to live with us?" And when he saw that You're okay. And when he saw that he agreed to this with all sincerity, he then asked him what evil he had done in the world. And when he saw that he readily confessed everything, he tried him still further and said, "I want you to tell this in the presence of all the brethren." But he really did hate his sin, and scorning all shame, without the least hesitation he promised to do it. "And if you like," he said, "I will tell it in the middle of the city of Alexandria." And so the shepherd gathered all his sheep in the church to the number of 230, and during divine service, for it was Sunday, after the reading of the gospel, he introduced this irreproachable convict. He was dragged by several of the brethren, who gave him moderate blows. His hands were tied behind his back. He was dressed in a hair shirt. His head was sprinkled with ashes. All were astonished at the sight, and immediately a woeful cry rang out, for no one knew what was happening. Then, when the thief appeared at the doors of the church, that holy superior who had such love for souls said to him in a loud voice, "Stop, you are not worthy to enter here." Dumbfounded by the voice of the shepherd coming from the sanctuary, for he thought, as he afterwards assured with oaths, that he had heard not a human voice but thunder, he immediately fell on his face, trembling and shaking all over with fear. As he lay on the ground and moistened the floor with his tears, this wonderful physician, using all means for his salvation and wishing to give all an example of saving and effectual humility, again exhorted him, in the presence of all, to tell in detail what he had done. And with terror he confessed, one after another, all his sins, which revolted every ear, not only sins of the flesh, natural and unnatural, with rational beings and with animals, but even poisoning, murder, and many others, which it is not lawful to hear or commit to writing. And when he had finished his confession, the shepherd at once allowed him to be given the habit and numbered among the brethren. Amazed by the wisdom of that holy man, I asked him when we were alone, "Why did you make such an extraordinary show?" That true physician replied, "For 2 reasons. Firstly, in order to deliver the penitent himself from future shame by present shame." And it really did that, Brother John. For he did not rise from the floor until he was granted remission of all his sins. And do not doubt this, that for one of the brethren who was there confided to me, saying, "I saw someone terrible holding a pen and writing tablet. And as the prostrate man told each sin, he crossed it out with a pen. And this is likely, for it says, 'I will confess mine iniquities before the Lord against myself, and thou forgavest the ungodliness of my heart.' Secondly, because there are others in the brotherhood who have unconfessed sins, I want to induce them to confess too, for without this no one will obtain forgiveness. I saw much else too that was admirable and worth remembering with that ever memorable pastor and his flock, and a large part of it I shall try to bring to your knowledge also. For I stayed a considerable time with him, following their manner of life, and was greatly astonished to see how those earth dwellers were imitating the heavenly beings.
Okay, before you go on, one of the practices that was used in the early church was public confession. And so maybe not quite with all the dramatics that this was intentionally put together with, but there was certainly in certain circumstances that people would publicly confess all of their sins before entering into the church or entering into monastic life, as in this case. And as today in monastic life, you make a lifetime confession before you enter.
Publicly?
What?
Publicly or
no?
Okay.
I mean, you can do it publicly if you want.
Yes.
by desire.
What's with the moderate blows?
Yes.
Several of the brothers gave him
Seems extreme.
Well, they were. Remember,
moderate blows.
This is a very different culture. You know, it's a very different time, and corporal punishment was nothing unusual. It was used in the monasteries. It was used in schools. It was used in certainly in the workplace. It was used with slaves. It was used. It was probably not used among the upper classes, but that's probably the only place it wasn't used.
Do you think that that's the origin of like Western flagellation?
No, because that's self-inflicted. In the West, they used corporal punishment as well. So, the rule of Saint Benedict, it talks about that. Only the qualification is the abbot shouldn't do it with his own hand. He shouldn't strike the person with his own hand. So, it's a different culture.
We grew up with that at school.
Really?
Flagellation?
No, corporal punishment.
Oh, I see.
Of numerous different varieties.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's the stories left of the nuns in Catholic school hitting you on the hands with a ruler. But and there used to be paddles, and some of them had holes in them so that they whistle as they went. But for the most part, I think American schools got rid of that.
Yeah, that doesn't exist anymore.
They should go back to that.
There was corporal punishment in public schools as well.
Yeah.
My grandfather and his brothers talked about it. But I think it did go away.
We'd probably be better.
It was probably even still around in the
So.
50s.
Yeah, it probably went through the
Not so
50s.
much problems.
I mean, my dad talks
Maybe it
about
was
that in the
decreasing.
60s.
Different jurisdictions didn't do it as much.
I don't know if that's still around in a private setting. That would be but I doubt it.
I feel like it is.
It is, yeah.
It has to be in some circles. I mean, maybe, not publicly spoken of, but
Yeah.
it's probably there.
There's just a lot of laws now and a lot of auditing. And,
Yeah.
I mean, I've worked in some sense with the school scene, and it's so different. Even when I went to school just a few years ago, it was so different. With some of the clients I've set up now. On their
You
payrolls.
use corporal punishment in the business world?
No, they don't. No,
They should.
No, but I mean, I just meant, it was a kind of a parallel subject, but even just watching schools now operate versus even the schools that I went to when I grew up.
Right. Time to
Two
switch
totally
gears.
different rule sets and just metal detectors and all this nonsense. No, it's really, wow. It's really sad. Yeah.
Well, here, the blows and things wasn't meant as punishment. He wasn't being punished for his sins. He was being humiliated.
Okay.
He was being humiliated and shamed. That by humiliation and shame now, he'd be spared humiliation and shame at the Last Judgment. And Elder Zacharias talks about in his books how important it is to experience shame when you go to confession. Because to the degree that you open yourself up to experience the shame of your sins, to that degree you'll be liberated from it. Because, ultimately we don't have a whole lot of shame for our sins. And maybe we should. Maybe we should. So, then there's this other image in that of the angel with a pen and a book, who was crossing out each sin as it was confessed, and that's very much in the literature, because confession is ultimately an image of the Last Judgment. And that if we confess now, we don't have to confess then. So, okay, 14.
In this flock they were united by the indissoluble bond of love. And what was still more wonderful, it was free from all familiarity and idle talk. More than anything else, they tried not to wound a brother's conscience in any way. And if anyone ever showed hatred to another, the shepherd put him in the isolation monastery like a convict. And once, when one of the brethren spoke ill of his neighbor to the shepherd, the holy man at once ordered him to be driven out, saying, "I cannot allow a visible as well as an invisible devil in the monastery." I saw among these holy fathers things that were truly profitable and admirable. I saw a brotherhood gathered and united in the Lord, with a wonderful life of action and divine vision, for they were so occupied with divine thoughts, and they exercised themselves so much in good deeds, that there was scarcely any need for the superior to remind them of anything, but of their own good will they aroused one another to a divine vigilance. For they had certain holy and divine exercises that were defined, studied, and fixed. If in the absence of the superior one of them began to use abusive language or criticize people or simply talk idly, some other brother by a secret nod reminded him of this, and quietly put a stop to it. But if by chance the brother did not notice, then the one who reminded him would make a prostration and retire. And the incessant and ceaseless topic of their conversation, when it was necessary to say anything, was the remembrance of death and the thought of eternal judgment.
So that's always a very good strategy for dealing with gossip, is to simply absent yourself from the conversation.
I must not omit to tell you about the wonderful achievement of the baker of that community. Seeing that he had attained to constant recollection and tears during his service, I asked him to tell me how he came to be granted such a grace. And when I pressed him, he replied, I have never thought that I was serving men but God. And having judged myself unworthy of all rest, by this visible fire I am unceasingly reminded of the future flame. Let us hear about another surprising attainment of theirs. For not even in the refectory did they stop noetic activity, but according to a certain custom, these blessed men reminded one another of interior prayer by secret signs and gestures. And they did this not only in the refectory, but at every encounter and gathering. And if one of them committed a fault, he would receive many requests from the brothers to allow them to take the case to the shepherd and bear the responsibility and the punishment. That is why this great man, on learning that his disciples did this, inflicted lighter punishments, knowing that the one punished was innocent. And he did not even inquire who had actually sustained the fall. Could any hint of idle talk and joking exist among them? If one of them began a dispute with his neighbor, then another, passing by, assumed the role of penitent and so dissolved the anger. But if he noticed that the disputants were spiteful or revengeful, he would report the quarrel to the father, occupying the second place after the superior, and prepare the ground for their mutual reconciliation before sundown. But if they continued obstinate, they would either be punished by being deprived of food until they were reconciled, or else be expelled from the monastery. And it is not in vain that this laudable rigor is brought to perfection among them, for it bears and shows abundant fruit. And among these holy fathers many became proficient both in active life and clairvoyance, both in discernment and humility. And there was to be seen among them an awful and angelic sight, venerable, sacred, and white-haired men running around in obedience like children, and glorifying in their humiliation. There I have seen men who had spent some 50 years in obedience, and when I had asked them to tell me what consolation they had gained from so great a labor, some of them replied that they had attained to humility's abyss, by which they had permanently repelled every assault. Others said that they had obtained complete insensibility and freedom from pain and calumnies and insults. Calumnies and insults. Calumnies. Mm-hmm. I have seen others of those ever memorable fathers with their angelic white hair attain of their own volition to the deepest innocence and to wise and divinely achieved simplicity. Just as an evil man is somewhat double, one thing outwardly and another inwardly, so a simple person is not something double, but something of a unity. Among them there are none who are fatuous and foolish, like old men in the world who are commonly said to be in their dotage. On the contrary, outwardly they are utterly gentle and kindly, radiant and sincere, and they have nothing hypocritical, affected, or false about them in either speech or character, a thing not found in many, and inwardly in their soul, like innocent babes, they make God himself and their superior their every breath, and the eye of their mind keeps a vigorous and strict watch for demons and passions. The whole of my life, dear and reverend Father and God-loving community, would be insufficient to describe the heavenly life and virtue of those blessed monks. But yet it is better to adorn our treaties and rouse you to zeal in the love of God by their most laborious struggles than by my own paltry counsels. For without any contradiction, the less is adorned by the better. Only this I ask, that you should not imagine that we are inventing what we write, for such a suspicion would detract from its value. But let us continue again what we were saying before.
Okay, questions? It's pretty straightforward.
Could you say a word on simplicity?
Well, I think one of the aspects of simplicity is always being the same person, not being double-minded, not being, not acting one way with one group and another way with another group, not being hypocritical, not being a man-pleaser, but simply being exactly who you are all the time, being honest and straightforward, even if it's a little naive, I think it's that kind of simplicity as opposed to being slightly dumb. There's no virtue in that. But it's to be completely free of hypocrisy, which is a huge spiritual achievement.
Lord Deacon. It's not so much in this story, although it touches on them responding to insults and calamities, but I was reading another story where one of the monks, there was a very humble elder, and he would go around wearing bare feet all the time, and the monk said to him, "You're just doing that to be so you can glory in that asceticism, and you should wear shoes." So he wore shoes even though it hurt his feet. But one of the more mature monks was sort of purposely it seems like he was hurling a accusation at him which he knew wasn't true, that he would further hone that monk. So wouldn't that be, because it seems like that would be a very hard thing to do, because how would the people around you know that you weren't to be taken to the superior by accusing your brother when you were actually doing it for his benefit? It's very sort of interesting to me.
Yeah, well, this is actually an issue that comes up in multiple places in this, and it's culturally a very different thing, because essentially by doing something like that, the monk is being honed, is being tempted, so that he can overcome the temptation and learn from it and grow by it. But he would have no sense that he's being tested. He would just have a sense that, well, this situation came up and I'm proved to be a fool, and just to accept it. In our culture, we don't understand being made a fool of. We don't understand humility. We don't understand. There's a lot that we don't understand.
And
we certainly don't understand being unhypocritical and simple. I'm sorry, you said?
No, I was also thinking from the point of view of the person who was doing that, who was provoking him. That would require a lot of maturity. That must be a more senior member, right?
Right. Yeah, it does talk about that in the text, and that's one of the tasks of the superior. And we'll get to a couple of stories later on about that are just. I just wouldn't fly in our culture. You get a lawsuit or something like that. So, but that was just how they operated. But it was all about spiritual training.
A certain man called Isadora, of magisterial rank, from the city of Alexandria, had recently renounced the world in the above-mentioned monastery, and I found him still there. That most holy shepherd, after accepting him, found that he was full of mischief, very cruel, sly, fierce, and arrogant. But with human ingenuity, that most wise man contrived to outwit the cunning of the devils, and said to Isadora, "If you have decided to take upon yourself the yoke of Christ, then I want you first of all to learn obedience." Isadora replied, "As iron to the smith, so I surrender myself in submission to you, Holy Father." The Great Father, making use of this comparison, at once gave exercise to the iron Isadora, and said, I truly want you, brother, to stand at the gate of the monastery, and to make a prostration to everyone coming in or going out, and to say, "Pray for me, Father, I am an epileptic." And he obeyed as an angel obeys the Lord.
Okay. A couple things on this. Iron Isadora is a pun in Greek. It's on the bottom. There's a note. In Greek it would be Sidero Isidoro. Sidero Isidoro. In other words, Isidore, the root word of Isadore is the word for iron. So, so this was also a time at which epilepsy was considered a mental illness. And, you know, because they didn't know what it was other than that. So it was either mental illness or demonic possession.
Demonic, yeah.
Could be either one. And so, on one hand, Isadora was being told, you know, to ask the fathers to pray for him because he's an epileptic, even though he wasn't even though he was not an epileptic. So but it was a means of self-humiliation. And this is very important because he was of magisterial rank. In other words, he was a high-level aristocrat. He was a senior imperial official. So for him to stand at the door of the monastery and say, make a prostration, everyone say, "Forgive me, pray for me, I'm an epileptic," was something profoundly humiliating to somebody of that rank. Now, standing at the door of the monastery or of the church was also not something unknown in that culture, because from about this time on for the next couple hundred years, there had evolved a whole system of penances that are actually in the Rudder, which is the book of canons. And there was this whole penitential system in which people would be assigned these very substantial and very public penances for their sins. One of those was that in that process of penance, say somebody committed a very serious sin, and they would be excommunicated for 10 years. Well, the first couple of years might be spent making a prostration to everybody coming into the church on the steps of the church who was not even permitted to enter the narthex, saying, "Forgive me, I have sinned. Forgive me, I have sinned." Each person for a couple of years. And he better be there every Sunday to do that. Then he'd be able to move into the narthex and maybe do that. So, and then eventually he'd be able to stop making the prostrations, but he still wouldn't be able to go beyond the narthex. In the ancient Byzantine churches, there was a big door into the church with the icons of Christ and the Mother of God, like we have royal doors. And actually, those were the royal doors. That was what was referred to as the royal doors. And the doors into the sanctuary, into the altar, were called the beautiful gates. So, a couple of years in front of the church, making prostrations, a couple of years in the narthex making prostrations, then just a couple of years without making prostrations, then you might be permitted to go into the nave, but would have to leave with the catechumens. And then finally, the last stage is that he might be able to stand all the way through the liturgy, but not receive Holy Communion. Needless to say, this system of penances did not last very long, because it was so strict that it would chase people away, obviously. Mm-hmm. But there are still remnants that we still have. So it would not have been unusual, for pious people going to a monastery or going to a church to have a penitent on the steps making a prostration and saying, "Pray for me," or whatever. Yeah.
We could get crazy doing that, no?
Well, probably.
Losing
yeah.
your mind.
How long did this go on for?
Yeah, you could do that for 2 years.
In the church history, 2 years. What era was this?
What really took off in the 600s was probably over by the 800s. A couple hundred years.
How much of the percentage of the congregation would be barred from communion at a time?
Well, if they were strict about it, probably a large proportion. But remember, at this time, it was politically expedient to be a member of the church. That was the main reason people became members of the church. Okay. And it wasn't because they had all of this faith and were. I mean, obviously some did, and you'd have to have a lot of faith, to persevere at something like that. But this was already the time in this turn of the 7th century when people who were really deeply committed to the faith aspect of being a Christian, when they would go to the monasteries. Because a lot of the people in the parishes were very nominal in their commitment to the church. So. Okay.
When he had spent 7 years there, he attained a deep humility and compunction. Then the glorious Father, after the lawful 7 years in the man's incomparable patience, judged him fully worthy to be numbered among the brethren, and wanted to have him ordained. But Isadora, through others and through my feeble intervention, implored the shepherd many times to let him finish his course as he was living before, vaguely hinting that his end and call were drawing near. And that was actually the case. For when his director had allowed him to remain as he was, 10 days later in this state he passed gloriously to the Lord. And on the 7th day after his own falling asleep, the porter of the monastery was also taken. For the blessed man had said to him, "If I have found favor in the sight of the Lord, in a short time you also will be inseparably joined to me there." And that is what happened in witness of his unashamed obedience and divine humility. When he was still living, I asked this great Isadora what occupation his mind had found during his time at the gate. And the renowned ascetic, wishing to help me, did not hide this from me. In the beginning, he said, I judged that I had been sold into slavery for my sins, and so it was with bitterness, with a great effort, and as it were with blood, that I made the prostration. But after a year had passed, my heart no longer felt sorrow, and I expected a reward for my patience from God himself. But when another year had gone by, I began to be deeply conscious of my unworthiness even to live in the monastery, and to see and meet the fathers, and to partake of divine mysteries. And I did not dare to look anyone in the face, but bending low with my eyes, still lower with my thought, I sincerely asked for the prayers of those coming in and going out. About Lawrence. Once, as we were sitting together in the refectory, this great superior put his holy mouth to my ear and said, "Do you want me to show you divine prudence in extreme old age?" And when I begged him to do so, the righteous man called from the second table one named Lawrence, who had been in the community about 48 years and was second priest in the monastery. He came and made a prostration to the abbot and took his blessing. But when he stood up, the abbot said nothing whatever to him, but left him standing by the table without eating. The midday meal had only just begun, and so he was standing for a good hour, or even 2. I was ashamed to look this toiler in the face, for his hair was quite white, and he was 80 years old. And when he got up, the saint sent him to the great Isadora, whom we mentioned above, to recite to him the beginning of the 39th Psalm. Should I read the little...
Sure.
Psalm 39 begins, "With patience I waited patiently for the Lord, and he was attentive unto me, and hearkened unto my supplication. And I, like a most worthless person, did not miss the chance of tempting the old man. And when I asked him what he was thinking of when he was standing by the table, he said, I thought of the shepherd as the image of Christ, and I considered that I had not received the command from him at all, but from God. And so I stood praying, Father John, not as before a table of men, but as before the altar of God. And because of my faith and love for the shepherd, no evil thought of him entered my mind, for love thinketh no evil. But know this, Father, that if anyone surrenders himself to simplicity and voluntary innocence, he no longer gives the devil either time or place to attack him."
So, if you think about it, that's a pretty awesome ascetic task to control one's thoughts, like that. But this is the goal, to learn how to completely control our thoughts, so that we don't allow any evil to disturb us.
Well, what about when demons implant things into our minds?
We ignore them. We're watchful to cut off the thought. Because we do have a choice as to whether we accept it or not. So it says here that the midday meal took an hour or even two. Most monasteries now, the meals are very quick. 10 minutes maybe. And you have to get there, wolf it down, and be all done, because after the bell you don't dare take another bite.
When did that change?
When does that change?
Yeah. I feel like there should be an hour now.
A long
time ago,
yeah.
I learned the hard way in non-athos about that. It's like there was a bell ringing, I'm like, what are they doing? Why are they getting up?
It's not about gormandizing.
Yeah.
Monasteries, the food tends to be very good.
Oh, it's excellent.
Yeah, it's good, it's pleasant, or it's well prepared, but it's not to be lingered over. It's to be eaten. So, and the pleasures of the table are not to be indulged in. So, anything else in this? But you think of that. You think of that kind of patience, and how easily one would be tempted to think evil of the abbot. Like, who is this guy? Why did he call me up for my meal so that I could just stand here and watch him? And so this last line of the section: if anyone surrenders himself to simplicity and voluntary innocence, then he no longer gives the devil either time or place to attack him. And that simplicity and voluntary innocence would be the assumption that nothing was meant for evil. Okay. So 27.
About the steward. God sent that just Savior of spiritual sheep under God another exactly like himself to be the steward of the monastery, for he was chaste and temperate as no one else, and meek as very few are. Once the great elder, for the edification of the others, pretended to get angry with him in church, and ordered him to be sent out before the time. Knowing that he was innocent of what the pastor accused him of, when we were alone I began to plead the cause of the steward before the great man. But the wise director said, "And I too know, Father, that he is not guilty, but just as it would be a pity and wrong to snatch bread from the mouth of a starving child, so too the director of souls does harm to both himself and to the ascetic if he does not give him frequent opportunities to obtain crowns such as the superior considers he merits at every hour by bearing insults, dishonor, contempt, or mockery."
So this would not fly in our culture.
For 3 very serious wrongs are done. First, the director himself is deprived of the rewards which he would receive for corrections and punishments. Secondly, the director acts unjustly when, by the virtue of that one person, he could have brought profit to others, but does not do so. And thirdly, the most serious harm is that often the very people who seem the most hard-working and patient, if left for a time without blame or reproach from the superiors, people confirmed in virtue, lose the weakness and patience they previously had. For even land that is good and fruitful and fertile, if left without the water of dishonor, can revert to forest, produce the thorns of vanity, cowardice, and audacity. Knowing this, that great apostle sent word to Timothy, "Be insistent, reprove, rebuke them in season and out of season." I disputed the matter with that true director, and reminded him of the infirmity of our race, and that the undeserved, or perhaps not undeserved, punishment may make many break away from the flock. Again, that temple of wisdom said, "A soul deprived to the shepherd with love and faith for Christ's sake will not leave him even if it were at the price of his blood, and especially if he has received through him the healing of his wounds. For he remembers him who says, 'Neither angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor any other creature can separate us from the love of Christ.' But if the soul is not attached, bound, and devoted to the shepherd in this way, then I wonder if such a man is not living in this place in vain, for he is united to the shepherd by a hypocritical and false obedience. And truly this great man is not deceived, but he has directed, led to perfection, and offered to Christ unblemished lambs. About
Abacyrus. Are there any questions? Comments? Yeah.
It wasn't exactly a list of the passions up on near the end of 27, but does that relate somehow to the part where they said at the bottom of 26 that there's no time or place to attack them, like we're attacked through our unresolved passions?
Yeah. Well, we're attacked through our unresolved passions, but especially when we're externally slighted. And especially when it comes to vanity, cowardice, audacity, the other kinds of things. So the job of the superior in this text is to do his best to provoke a reaction, but expect none, and or with the idea that the disciple will not react. The disciple will control himself, because it's in that self-control that he exhibits spiritual growth, especially when being falsely accused.
If someone's falsely accused, should they tell the truth? I mean, to admit to falsehoods is also to lie. Mm-hmm. And if the people are making false accusations, and one agrees with it, it could encourage them in evil as well.
Right, but you see, this it's a very different There's a very different attitude in the culture that produced this and in our culture.
Yes.
Because a lie is a great sin in our culture.
Well, according to the Ten Commandments, if you still practice them, and you don't practice a lot of its old ritual from Israelites, but that is
Right, but here he's using lies essentially as a means of spiritual testing. And he uses lies and deceit.
Is it then later resolved by the truth?
Well, yeah. But it's not a matter of justifying ourselves and saying, no, that's a false accusation. I didn't do that.
What should one do? Or is this
Well, if we were in 7th century Sinai, one would probably do something rather different than what one does now. Because it's a totally different culture, and our culture isn't mature enough to understand that, how they operated. We're too caught up in self-justification. We're too caught up in our own sense of our own justice. Because it's an offense against justice, right? It's unjust to be falsely accused.
But it does damage to the one who makes the false accusation as
Well,
well. Prevailing there.
Well, I think there's a difference between a false accusation coming from somebody out of malice and a false accusation coming from a monastic superior who's trying to test you.
Oh, yes.
So,
But is that still used in monasticism today?
probably in some places. Remember, there's many different cultures in the Orthodox Church. Anything else? Okay, 27.
And 29.
29? Oh yeah, that was ours.
Let us hear and wonder at the wisdom of God found in earthen vessels. When I was in the same monastery, I was amazed at the faith and patience of the novices, and how they bore rebukes and insults from the superior with invincible fortitude, and sometimes even expulsion, and endured this not only from the superior, but even from those far below him. For my spiritual edification, I questioned one of the brothers called Abasiris, who had lived 15 years in the monastery, for I saw that almost all greatly maltreated him, and those who served drove him out of the refectory almost every day because the brother was by nature just a little too talkative. And I said to him, Brother Abasiris, why do I see you being driven out of the refectory every day, and often going to bed without supper? He replied, Believe me, Father, my fathers are testing me to see whether I am really a monk, but they are not doing this in real earnest. And knowing the great man's aim and theirs, I bear all this without becoming downcast, and I have done so now for 15 years. For on my entry into the monastery, they themselves told me that those who renounce the world are tested 30 years. And rightly, Father John, for without trial, gold is not purified. This heroic Abasiris lived in the monastery for 2 years after my coming there, and then passed to the Lord. For just before his death he said to the fathers, I am thankful to the Lord and to you, for having been tempted by you for my salvation, I have lived for 17 years without temptations from devils. The just shepherd duly rewarded him and offered him as a confessor to be buried with the local saints. About Macedonius, the archdeacon. I should be quite unjust to all enthusiasts for perfection if I were to bury in the tomb of silence the achievement and reward of Macedonius, the first of the deacons there. This man, so devoted to the Lord, just before the feast of the Holy Theophany, actually 2 days before it, once begged the pastor for permission to go to Alexandria for a certain personal need of his, promising to return from the city as soon as possible for the approaching festival and the preparation for it. But the devil, the hater of good, hindered the archdeacon, and though released by the abbot, he did not return to the monastery for the holy feast at the time appointed by the superior. On his returning a day late, the pastor deposed him from the diaconate, and put him in the rank of the lowest novices. But that good deacon of patience and archdeacon of endurance accepted the father's decision as calmly as if another had been punished and not himself. And when he had spent 40 days in that state, the wise pastor raised him again to his own rank. But scarcely a day had passed before the archdeacon begged the pastor to leave him in his former discipline and dishonor, saying, "I committed an unforgivable sin in the city." But knowing that Macedonius was telling him an untruth, and that he sought punishment only for the sake of humility, the saint yielded to the good wish of the ascetic. Then what a sight there was! An honored elder with white hair spending his days as a novice and sincerely begging everyone to pray for him. "For," said he, "I fell into the fornication of disobedience. But this great Macedonius in secret told me, lowly though I am, why he voluntarily pursued such a humiliating course of life. Never," he assured me, "have I felt in myself such relief from every conflict and such sweetness of divine light as now. It is the property of angels," he continued, "not to fall, and even, as some say, it is quite impossible for them to fall. It is a property of men to fall, and to rise again as often as this may happen. But it is the property of devils, and devils alone, not to rise once they have fallen." Again about the steward. The brother who was the steward of the monastery confided this to me. "When I was young," he said, "and was looking after cattle, I once had a very serious spiritual fall. But as it was never my habit to hide a snake in the hole of my heart, I caught it by the tail, and by the tail I mean the end of the business, and at once showed it to the physician. But with a smiling face he struck me lightly on the jaw and said to me, 'Go, child, and continue your work as before, without being afraid in the least.' And accepting this with flaming faith, in the course of a few days I received the assurance of my healing, and continued my way with both joy and fear." Every kind of creature, as some say, has its differences which distinguish it from others. So too in the company of the brothers there were differences both in success and disposition. When their physician noticed that some liked to display themselves before the people of the world who were visiting the monastery, then in the presence of such visitors he subjected them to extreme insults and gave them the most humiliating tasks, so that they began to beat a hasty retreat, and the arrival of secular visitors proved to be their victory. Then an extraordinary spectacle revealed itself, vanity chasing herself away and escaping from people.
Any questions? So one of the things that he brings up later in the book is using one passion to thwart another. So, for example, using vainglory to thwart the passion of self-display. In other words, pride and vainglory, or pride.
Can you explain that?
In other words, well, okay. So the situation was there are these monks who like to hang out with the visitors, and which was contrary to the rules, and they like to kind of, parade them, take out their cool clothes and how wise they were, and and how respectable and all of this kind of stuff. And so the abbot would come, says, in the presence of such visitors, he subjected them to extreme insults and gave them the most humiliating task, so that they began to beat a hasty retreat. And so here he would come, Mr. False novice elder, would be prancing around in front of the visitors, displaying himself, and the elder would come in and say, I want you to go clean up after the horses, and then and then take that and put it over in the dump pile, and you don't need to be talking to these people. Who do you think you are? You're just an idiot. Take off, go do, and they could get brutal, Did I tell about it's at Platina, the Father Damascene was writing the life of Father Seraphim the first time, and so he would be writing and then he would bring the new chapter to Trapeza, and they'd read it in the Trapeza, and of course Father Damascene would be proud of his work, and Father Herman would get up from the table, because he would always give a little talk after Trapeza, and he would say, "You idiot, you don't know anything. How can you possibly write all of this nonsense? You don't have a clue what went on. You're just a fool." And on and on and on. I was just berating him, deriding him. And then he would dictate how he thought it should be. So that still goes on, but not quite. But it depends the context, and it depends on the elder. I never used that method myself, so not that I didn't want to. but as with disciplining children, you never do it out of anger. You do it in love. So if you can call somebody a fool and an idiot and a nincompoop and so forth out of love, more power to you. And so anyway, so the brothers that like to display themselves before the visitors, when they saw the abbot coming, would flee, knowing what was going to happen. So they were saved from their vainglory by vainglory.
Well, they didn't want to be humiliated in front
Right.
of us.
Right. There's a very old, as you can see, method of treating subordinates in the Orthodox Church. And that's the way of humiliation. In our culture, it doesn't work. Humiliation does not lead to humility. Humiliation leads to shame. And I think part of that is because in our culture, there's already a foundation of shame in so many people. Shame, self-hatred, self-loathing. That if the abbot publicly were to go off on some kid, like that, it would just destroy him. And the idea is not to destroy him, it's to knock him down a peg into reality. Do you think that's... Does that make sense?
We have a concept of being punked, where like somebody kind of exalts himself above you, and so like when that kind of thing happens, I mean, I don't know in the context of monasticism, but just on like I guess a lower level of culture, if somebody's like insulting you, at least in the culture that I'm surrounded by, the natural response that you're expected to do is to want to fight them, or physically confront them, or throw it back toward. It just creates conflict often.
Right.
It depends on the person too, but I think that's maybe just the DC area or something. But
well, no, I mean, people want to defend themselves when they're attacked, but in monastic context, if you give back talk and all of that kind of stuff, you're gone.
Okay.
You're history in that place. It's not tolerated. So, and it's important that it's not tolerated. Okay. This next paragraph, 32. It shows the value of confession, and as does all of this, and how important confession is, and it's a means of spiritual healing. And indeed, all of these things, including the insults, including the deceit, including the false accusations, are simply a means to healing. So, where are we on 33?
We're on 34,
34?
And between this heading and the next one is 12 pages.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want me to continue and stop there, or if you want to, because there's no way. I mean, I have a bookmark where I'm reading it at home, so I have no way to memorize.
Right. 36 is a long discourse. And we'll stop after 36.
Okay. About Saint Minos. As the Lord did not wish to deprive me of the prayer of a Holy Father in the same monastery, a week before my departure he took to himself a wonderful man called Minos, who occupied the second place after the superior, and had lived 59 years in the community, fulfilling all the various offices. On the third day after the falling asleep of this holy man, when we had performed the customary rites over him, suddenly the whole place where the saint was resting was filled with fragrance. Then the great man allowed us to uncover the coffin in which he had been placed, and when this was done, we all saw that fragrant myrrh was flowing like two fountains from his precious feet. Then that teacher said to all, "Look, the sweat of his toils and labors have been offered as myrrh to God and truly accepted." The fathers of that place told us of many triumphs of this most saintly Minos, and amongst others the following. Once the superior wanted to test his God-given patience. In the evening Minos came to the abbot's cell, and having prostrated before the abbot, asked him as usual to give him instruction. But the abbot left him lying on the ground till the hour of the office, and only then blessed him, and having rebuked him for being fond of self-display and for being impatient, he ordered him to get up. The holy man knew Minos would bear all this courageously, and therefore he made this scene for the edification of all. A disciple of Saint Minos confirmed what was told us about his director, and added, "I was inquisitive to know whether sleep overcame him when he lay prostrate before the abbot. He assured me that while lying on the ground he had recited by heart the whole Psalter. I must not fail to adorn the crown of this step with this emerald." Once I started a discussion on stillness with some of the most experienced elders in the community. With a smile on their faces and in jovial mood, they said to me in a friendly way, "We, Father John, being material, live a material life, preferring to wage war according to the measure of our weakness, and considering it better to struggle with men who are sometimes fierce and sometimes repentant, than with demons who are continually raging and up in arms against us." One of those ever memorable fathers who had boldness of speech and great love for me according to God, once said to me kindly, If, wise man, you have within you the power of him who said, "I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me," If the Holy Spirit has descended upon you with the dew of purity, as upon the Holy Virgin, if the power of the Most High has overshadowed you with patience, then like the man, Christ our God, gird your loins with the towel of obedience, and having risen from the supper of stillness, wash the feet of the brethren in a spirit of contrition, or rather, roll yourself under the feet of the community in spiritual self-abasement. At the gate of your heart, place strict and unsleeping guards. Restrain your unrestrainable mind within your active body. Amidst the actions and movements of your limbs, practice noetic stillness. And most paradoxical of all, in the midst of commotion, be unmoved in soul. Curb your tongue, which rages to leap into arguments. 70 times 7 in the day wrestle with this tyrant. Fix your mind to your soul, as to the wood of a cross, to be struck like an anvil with blow upon blow of the hammers, to be mocked, abused, ridiculed, and wronged, without being in the least crushed or broken, but continuing to be quite calm and immovable. Shed your own will as a garment of shame, and thus stripped of it, enter the practice ground. Array yourself in the rarely acquired breastplate of faith, not crushed or wounded by distrust towards your spiritual trainer. Check with the rein of temperance the sense of touch that leaps forward shamelessly. By meditation on death, bridle your eyes, which are ready to waste hour after hour looking at physical grandeur and beauty. Still your mind, over busy with private concerns, and thoughtlessly prone to criticize and condemn your brother, by the practical means of showing your neighbor all love and sympathy. By this shall all men truly know, dearest Father, that we are disciples of Christ, if while living together we have love for one another. Come, come, said this good friend, come and dwell with us, and for living water drink derision at every hour. For David, having tried every pleasure under heaven, last of all said in bewilderment, Behold now, what is so good or so joyous as for brethren to dwell together in unity? But if we have not yet been granted this good, that is, such patience and obedience, then it is best for us, having at least discovered our weakness, to live apart, far from the athletic lists, and bless the combatants, and pray that they may be granted patience. I was won over to the good arguments of this most excellent father and teacher, who disputed with me in an evangelical and prophetic manner, or rather as a friend, and without hesitation I agreed to give the honors to blessed obedience.
That discourse of chapter 36 is really, it's quite beautiful and good advice, something to ponder. What do you think? Could we go to the end of the page?
I'd like to keep going.
You would?
Yeah, I would.
Yeah, we will stop at the end of the page.
Okay. And now, when I have noted yet another profitable virtue of these blessed fathers, which comes as it were from paradise, I shall then come back to my own unlovely and worthless bunch of thistles. The pastor noticed that some repeatedly carried on conversation when we were standing in prayer. Such people he stood for a whole week by the church, and ordered them to make a prostration to everyone going in and out. And what was still more surprising, he did this even with the clergy, in fact with the priests. Noticing that one of the brothers stood during the psalm singing with more heartfelt feeling than many of the others, and that his movements and the changes of his face made it look as though he was talking to somebody, especially at the beginning of the hymns, I asked him to explain what this habit of the blessed man meant. And knowing that it was for my benefit not to hide it, he told me, I have the habit, Father John, at the very beginning, of collecting my thoughts, my mind, and my soul, and summoning them. I cry to them, O come, let us worship and fall down before Christ, our King and God. Having earnestly observed the activities of the brother in charge of the refectory, I saw that he always had in his belt a small book, and I learnt that he wrote his thoughts in it each day and showed them all to the shepherd. And I saw that not only he, but also many of the brethren there did the same. And this, as I heard, was by order of that great shepherd. Once one of the brothers was expelled by him for slandering his neighbor to him and calling him a windbag and a gossip. The expelled man did not leave the gates of the monastery for a whole week, begging to be granted entry and forgiveness. When that lover of souls learnt of this, and heard that this brother had nothing to eat for 6 days, he told him, "If you have a resolute desire to live in the monastery, I will degrade you to the rank of a penitent." And when the penitent gladly accepted this, the pastor ordered him to be taken to the separate monastery for those who were mourning over their falls. And that was done. But since we have mentioned that monastery, I shall now speak of it briefly.
Okay. So we'll end there for tonight, because the prison is a topic all of its own. One of the things that's, I think, really so important in this is the extolling of the virtue of humility. Humility and obedience go together, because it's only in humility that one can be obedient. It's through cutting off one's will, through cutting off one's selfish desires, one attains to humility, which is a state not of, it's not about beating yourself up and degrading yourself, but humility is voluntarily accepting the will of the other. And especially it's voluntarily accepting the will of God, rather than asserting one's own will and claiming one's rights. This is probably one of the most important aspects of monastic life, and one of the greatest of the virtues. What else? Questions? Comments?
I've heard it said that my kind of belief is without humility, it's not possible to grow in the other virtues.
Right.
Because I have to recognize that without it, it's not possible. It's the foundation of all spiritual progress.
Well, if you have no humility, you're totally caught up in your own ego, and if there are the other virtues, they would all be hypocritical. And be used for vainglory and pride. And you can't use humility for pride and vainglory, not if it's real. What else? Okay. So we'll end there. So on Friday is St. Demetrius. We'll have liturgy at the Skeet in my house on Friday morning, 10 o'clock, for those who can make it. So Mother Judith wants me to come up to Frederick on Saturday and do a Moleben and bless her new Skeet up there. So that should be interesting. It's she's bit off a whole lot, and I hope it's not more than she can chew, because it's this house, which is a mess, this huge house on several acres, which is a mess.
Where is it?
It's in Frederick,
Peter?
just on the south end of town.
Do we want this anymore?
So yeah, that's fun. Okay. So we can pray. It is truly meet to bless the Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim. Without corruption thou gavest birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for faithful, always known to ages of ages. Amen.